The day I took back the land, everyone said I'd lost it for good. My stepfamily stood across the courtroom, staring at me like they'd seen a ghost. My stepmother's face had drained of all color. One of her sons kept tugging at his tie every few seconds, while the other refused to even glance my way. The judge signed a stack of documents, pushed them across the desk, and in that instant, everything shifted. 2 years before, they had stripped away my inheritance. Now they were about to lose far more than they'd ever taken. But to make sense of how we got here, you need to know about my father, the farm, and the mistake my stepfamily made when they confused my patience for weakness. My name is Ethan Walker, and I was raised just outside a small farming town in southern Missouri, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip outran the mail carrier, and where my family had worked the same land longer than anyone could recall. The farm was never some sprawling corporate operation. Just 50 acres, a weathered farmhouse, a couple of barns, some aging tractors that constantly needed fixing, and fields my father loved more than almost anything else in the world. While other kids grew up on baseball diamonds, I grew up in the cab of a tractor beside my dad, listening to him talk about soil like it was the most captivating subject imaginable. Looking back, I understand now he wasn't really teaching me farming at all. He was teaching me responsibility, patience, and the value of leaving things better than you found them. My mother died when I was still young, leaving just the two of us for years. Eventually, he married a woman named Linda Mercer, who brought along her 2 teenage sons, Grant and Tyler. From the outside, we looked like a blended family. In truth, we were closer to strangers sharing a roof. Linda stayed pleasant whenever Dad was nearby. Warm smiles, supportive words, but something beneath the surface never rang true. As I got older, it became clear she saw the farm through a completely different lens than my father did. For him, that land was family legacy. For her, it was simply an asset, a figure on a balance sheet, something to eventually cash in. Dad and I rarely spoke about inheritance, since I genuinely didn't care about that side of things. I cared about the farm because it was home. Still, now and then, usually after a long day working the fields, he'd gaze out over the property and tell me, "Someday this will all be yours. Just promise you'll look after it." I'd laugh it off, insisting he'd outlive us all. But life doesn't concern itself with plans. Dad fell ill without warning. What began as exhaustion turned into doctor visits, then treatment, then extended hospital stays. Within a year, he was gone. I won't pretend I handled it gracefully. I didn't. Losing him felt like the ground had vanished beneath me. For weeks, I drifted through life in a haze. Then came the will reading. I walked into that law office bracing for grief. Maybe some tense family exchanges. Nothing worse. Instead, I stepped straight into an ambush. Linda was already seated, dressed in a tailored navy suit I'd never seen before. Grant and Tyler sat next to her, looking oddly self-assured. Not grieving, but eager. That alone should have warned me. As the attorney began reading through the documents, I quickly sensed something was deeply wrong. A revised will had surfaced, supposedly signed just months before my father passed. According to this new version, Linda inherited nearly everything: the house, the land, the equipment, the accounts. Grant and Tyler stood to gain ownership shares down the line. And me? I was left with a modest cash payout that wouldn't cover a year's rent in the city. I assumed there had to be an error. I remember leaning in and saying, "That's not possible. My father would never agree to this." The room fell silent. Then Linda clasped her hands together and gave me a smile I'll never forget. Not warm, not sympathetic, but the kind of smile someone wears when they're savoring your confusion. The attorney launched into legal jargon. Signature verification, witnesses, documentation, probate, language crafted to make regular people feel powerless. I demanded to see every page. I questioned the dates. I questioned the signatures. I questioned everything about the circumstances. Grant actually laughed and said, "Come on, Ethan, it's over. You lost. Move forward." Tyler leaned back and added, "It's just business. Don't make it personal. Business." Those words still echo in my head. My father's entire existence reduced to a transaction. I walked out of that office holding a thin envelope and a fury I had never felt before. But the anger wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the doubt. Would anyone ever take my side? Was the paperwork truly unbreakable? Had they been thorough enough to erase every trace? Over the following months, I fought however I could. Asking questions, hiring a lawyer I could barely afford, and got nowhere. Every path led to a locked door. Every question ended in another dead end. Eventually, my money ran dry, my options ran dry, and for the first time in my life, I walked away from the farm and into a cramped little apartment. Above a laundromat in St. Louis, where the washing machines clattered through the night and the scent of detergent seeped up through the floorboards. It felt like a completely different world from the one I'd left behind. Friends back home assumed I'd been crushed. Linda and her sons probably assumed the same. Maybe they figured time would erase what happened, that I'd eventually just forget. But the truth was far simpler than that. I wasn't forgetting a thing. I was waiting, and without knowing it, they were already laying the groundwork for their own downfall. At first, this new life felt like a sentence I was serving. I took a job at a land surveying and title research firm, the kind of place nobody thinks twice about until they're buying property or fighting over it. The pay was nothing special, the office coffee tasted like burnt soil, and most of my days went to sorting through files nobody else wanted to touch. But slowly, something started to click. Land leaves a trail. Every sale, every permit, every easement, every zoning application, every environmental review, every lien, every tax record. Someone somewhere writes it down. And if you're patient enough, those records begin to tell a story. Most people see paperwork and think tedium. I started seeing patterns, motives, mistakes. About a year and a half after leaving the farm, I came across something that made me freeze. A development proposal filed under a company name I didn't recognize for a project called Meadow Ridge Estates. The site spanned several dozen acres just outside my hometown. It didn't click right away until I checked the parcel numbers. My stomach dropped. It was my father's land, or what had once been his land. Linda and her sons weren't farming it anymore, and they certainly weren't preserving it. They were converting the entire property into a luxury housing development. Hundreds of homes, man-made ponds, walking paths, a clubhouse, glossy brochures filled with smiling families standing on ground they had no idea about. I remember staring at my screen and letting out a laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. The one thing my father cherished most was the very thing they wanted to tear apart. What really grabbed my attention, though, wasn't the development itself, it was how they were financing it. Public records revealed enormous loans, construction financing, investor capital, private lending deals. They had leveraged almost everything they owned. The farm wasn't just involved in the project. It was the collateral holding it all together. If the development collapsed, so would everything else. That's when I dug in further. Most people only knew that land as farmland. I knew it intimately. I knew where the deer sheltered in winter, where the creek overflowed after heavy storms, where my father refused to touch the trees because certain birds nested there every spring. I knew where old stone foundations lay buried under brush, remnants of families who'd settled their generations before us. As a kid, I thought my father was simply sentimental about the land. As an adult, I began to understand he'd been safeguarding something. Things that would be very inconvenient for developers to discover after they'd already borrowed millions. So every night after work, I started researching. One evening turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I combed through environmental databases, historical records, conservation maps, county archives, wildlife reports, old aerial photographs, federal land surveys. The further I went, the more staggering it became. Protected wetlands, several sensitive habitats, historic settlement markers, drainage restrictions, migration paths for endangered species. It was like uncovering sticks of dynamite buried beneath a construction site. What stunned me wasn't that these problems existed. It was that Linda and her sons either had no idea or simply didn't care. Maybe they believed money could fix anything. Maybe their consultants only told them what they wanted to hear. Either way, they'd staked their entire financial future on land far more complicated than they realized. One evening, I drove back home for the first time in months. I parked near the old property line and walked into the woods as the sun began to set. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. The The same creek, the same trees, the same stillness. I ended up standing near a stretch of wetland where my father used to take me as a boy. I could almost hear his voice. Some things matter more than money, Ethan. Back then, I thought he meant nature. Years later, I realized he'd been talking about character all along. That's when the plan finally began to take shape. It all finally came together. I wasn't going to confront them head-on. Direct fights are too predictable. People brace themselves for lawsuits. They brace for arguments and confrontations. What they never brace for is the truth arriving from a dozen directions at once. So I began assembling a file, not a complaint, not a lawsuit, but a complete record, photographs, reports, species documentation, historical records, environmental restrictions, maps, survey data, government references. Every fact carefully sourced, every claim backed by evidence. I approached it like the most important project of my life because it was. Then, quietly, I began distributing the information. An environmental review board received one package. A local conservation group received another. A historical preservation society got a copy too. Then a regional newspaper. Then a journalist known for exposing development scandals. No one traced any of it back to me. I made certain of that. The response came faster than I anticipated. Within weeks, questions started surfacing, followed by investigations, then public meetings. Reporters began asking pointed questions. Environmental groups demanded further studies. Historical experts called for site evaluations. Government agencies stalled approvals pending review. Almost overnight, Meadow Ridge Estates stopped being a promising development and became a controversial one. Investors despise controversy. Lenders despise uncertainty. And developers absolutely despise delays when loan payments are due every month. I watched it all unravel from a distance. One investor group pulled out, then another. Construction timelines slipped. More environmental reviews were mandated. Costs climbed. Deadlines were missed. The local paper published a piece questioning whether the project should have ever been approved. Then came television coverage. Not national, just small regional news, the kind that stings even more because everyone has to face their neighbors afterward. Meanwhile, Linda and her sons were hemorrhaging money like they were bailing out a sinking ship with a bucket. Consultants, lawyers, specialists, PR firms, more consultants, more lawyers. Every fix cost money. Every delay cost money. Every month, the debt climbed higher. Through industry connections, I picked up rumors here and there. Nervous investors, contractors demanding guarantees, lenders pushing for answers. The pressure was mounting from every side. Then, one afternoon, I discovered something even more compelling than the environmental problems. The primary lender had started internally labeling portions of the project as distressed debt. I must have stared at that document for a solid 10 minutes. Distressed debt. That single phrase changed everything because up to that point, my goal had simply been revenge. Now an entirely new possibility opened up. Opportunity. I spent weeks studying financial acquisitions, loan purchases, debt restructuring, and foreclosure law. The more I learned, the clearer the path became. Linda and her sons no longer controlled their own future. The bank did, and banks don't operate on sentiment. Banks don't care about family drama. They care about recovering their money. A few months later, I set up a meeting. Not as Ethan Walker, the grieving son who'd lost the farm, but as a private investor interested in acquiring distressed assets. The executives I met looked worn down, having spent years trying to rescue a failing project. I laid out a proposal, professional, calm, straightforward, offering to buy the debt portfolio at a steep discount. One executive asked why I'd want to take on such a mess. I just smiled and told him that value often hides beneath bad management. He laughed. If only he'd known the truth. For most of my life, I'd been known simply as the farmer's son, the kid everybody recognized. But 2 years had changed me. I no longer carried anger, at least not the kind that keeps you tossing at night. What I carried instead was certainty. About 20 minutes before the hearing began, Linda walked in with Grant and Tyler. The confidence they once wore like armor was gone. Their expensive suits still looked sharp, but exhaustion has a way of showing through fabric. Grant noticed me first, his eyes widening. Tyler followed his gaze. Then Linda turned around. For a moment, nobody said a word. Confusion crossed her face, then suspicion, then worry. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The hearing itself turned out to be surprisingly brief. That's the strange thing about legal battles. Movies make them look dramatic, but real life usually comes down to paperwork. Documents either back you up or they don't. Facts either exist or they don't. The judge reviewed the loan agreements, the payment history, the default notices, the foreclosure filings, and every supporting record. Everything checked out. Everything was legal. Everything had been handled exactly as required. Linda's attorney requested more time. The judge asked on what grounds. He shuffled through papers, offered vague explanations, referenced market conditions and project setbacks. The judge listened patiently, then asked the only question that actually mattered. Had the payments been made? Silence followed. The attorney lowered his eyes. No, Your Honor. The judge simply nodded. That was, in essence, the end of it. Minutes later, the ruling came down. Foreclosure approved, ownership transferred under the terms of the debt agreement. Just like that, the land came back to me. Not through revenge, not through some hidden loophole, but through the very legal system they'd relied on when they took it from me in the first place. That's when Linda finally pieced together who had bought the debt. She stared at me like she couldn't process what she was hearing. You, she whispered. You did this. I rose slowly and told her no. She did this. Tyler was the first to erupt, shouting about sabotage, conspiracies, unfair treatment. Grant threw out threats of lawsuits and investigations, anything but accepting responsibility. The judge shut it down immediately. Their attorney looked like a man desperate to be anywhere else. As deputies guided everyone toward the exit, Linda stood frozen. For the first time since my father's death, she looked truly defeated. Not furious, not arrogant, just defeated. Outside the courthouse, reporters were already waiting. The controversy surrounding the development had drawn enough attention that local media wanted updates. Cameras swung toward Linda and her sons, and questions came rapidly. About wetlands, permits, investors, environmental reviews. No one cared to hear their answers anymore. The story had already taken shape in the public mind. Over the following months, the fallout kept spreading. Investors who'd lost money demanded explanations. Business partners quietly distanced themselves. Future opportunities dried up. Their names became tied to one of the most visible development failures the region had seen in years. I didn't need to do another thing. Momentum carried the rest. Oddly enough, none of that turned out to be the most rewarding part. People assume revenge tastes sweetest when your enemies fall. For me, the real moment came weeks later, when I drove back to the farm completely alone. No lawyers, no reporters, no celebration, just me. The property looked different than I remembered, maybe because I was seeing it through different eyes now. I walked the fields where my father and I had spent countless mornings mending fences and checking on crops. I crossed the creek where we used to fish when I was a boy. Eventually, I reached the wetland that had caused the development project so much trouble. The sun was setting, casting orange light across the water and reeds. Everything was silent. Standing there, I finally grasped something that had taken years to understand. My father hadn't left me the farm because of its value. He left it to me because I understood why it mattered. The land itself wasn't really the inheritance. The knowledge was. The patience was. The respect for things that can't be tallied on a balance sheet was. Linda and her sons saw acreage. My father saw a legacy. That's the real reason they lost and the real reason I eventually won. Not because I was smarter or luckier, but because I valued something they never could. A few months after reclaiming the property, I placed most of the environmentally sensitive areas under conservation protection, so no one could ever attempt something like this again. Some neighbors thought I'd lost my mind. Others called it admirable. Honestly, I stopped caring either way. I was sleeping better than I had in years. Now here's the part that still stirs debate whenever people hear this story. Some say I should have forgiven them and moved forward. Others insist I should have fought harder and pursued every last dollar they had. Personally, I believe life taught them a lesson far better than I ever could have. They spent years trying to seize something that was never truly theirs, and in doing so, they lost the very thing they were chasing. So maybe the real question isn't whether what I did was right or wrong. Maybe the real question is this. If someone manipulated the system to strip away your family's legacy, and years later you had a legal chance to reclaim it, would you do exactly what I did, or would you walk away and rebuild somewhere new?